Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Siobhan Carroll, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us. Today's webinar is how the new HITRUST changes can benefit you. This webinar will be an interactive webinar and should take about 45 minutes. Please submit any questions you have through the questions box on your control screen, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. All lines are muted, so we would prevent background noise. If you sent your question ahead of time, we have it and we'll answer it during the webinar. We've also created a couple of pop-up polls to help guide the conversation, so please do us solid and answer them when they pop up. After today's session, you'll receive an email from us, and if you're interested in a copy of the slides, please let us know. If you're interested in speaking to one of our security experts, please let us know as well. With that, I will introduce our two experts for today. We have Ryan Patrick and Liz Golden. Ryan is Enterprise Health Senior Vice President of Security Services. He has over 20 years of healthcare IT and security experience across multiple security frameworks. He's a cybersecurity expert and brings an innovative perspective to protecting information and organizational resources. Ryan has been a battalion commander at the United States Army Reserve since April 2017. His previous military assignments include serving as Global Enterprise Operations Center Team Chief for the U.S. Special Operations, Chief Information Officer of the 42nd Infantry Division within the New York Army National Guard as a Deputy Chief Information Officer, and Chief Information Officer of FEMA Region 2 Homeland Response Force. Liz is Enterprise Health's HITRUST Program Manager. As a HITRUST assessor for 3 years, Liz has accumulated a depth of knowledge about the challenges and nuances of the assessment process, whether working with organizations as small as 2 full-time employees or those with thousands. She's an expert in navigating the HITRUST framework to help organizations achieve certification. Now serving as HITRUST Program Manager, Liz uses her vast assessment experience to adapt Enterprise Health's program to the ever-changing HITRUST enhancements, expectations, and methodologies. As HITRUST evolves, Liz ensures that IH and our partner organizations evolve alongside it. With that, I will let Ryan and Liz take it away.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As Siobhan mentioned, this is designed to be somewhat collaborative, understanding that you all don't have the ability on audio, but I don't want you, or Liz and I don't want you to hold your questions to the end. Ask your questions in real time. Siobhan is monitoring the questions box, and depending on what the question and the relevance of the topic, we'll try to answer those questions in real time to only increase the relevance of the conversation. So don't wait. Give you a little bit of background about Enterprise. We've been in the cybersecurity game within healthcare for over 10 years now. We've been doing HITRUST for just about the same amount of time. We have a whole host of different services and products around risk management, proactive risk measures to prepare for audits or breaches and things of that nature. So we have a lot of different perspectives on what it takes to get HITRUST certified and how to help you. Here's some of our differentiators. I'm not gonna bore you with the details. What I'd probably point out just for relevance is, one, we've been doing HITRUST work since 2011. For those of you who may be familiar, HITRUST originally came out around 2009, so we've been in on this since just about the beginning, and we actually hold several seats on several councils within the HITRUST Alliance, one being the HITRUST Assessor Council, which I sit on, and then I also sit on a quality assurance subcommittee that gets insights, and I weigh my opinions on different things that HITRUST is doing. So we have a really, really good working relationship with the HITRUST Alliance, which I think only bodes well for those that we work with. So here's our first poll question, and it should be popping up on your screens. And really what this is designed to do is give us an idea of how to tailor the conversation to the audience. If someone is completely unfamiliar, then we can get more into the weeds. If the majority of the group is a seasoned veteran, then we can keep it a little more high level and get more specific in use cases. So I would appreciate if everybody could fill that out. And as you all are doing that, we'll go over the benefits real quick of HITRUST. I'm not going to read this slide to you. Bottom line is that there's a lot of genius between or in the HITRUST CSF and leveraging that to demonstrate your maturity from a security and privacy perspective, but also really understanding what it takes in a proactive nature to prepare your organization to deal with a disclosure or a breach or some kind of business continuity event. So HITRUST touches really every facet of an organization, but it also gives you all as the assessed entity a way to communicate your maturity and the great things that you're doing from a security and privacy perspective to what HITRUST calls your relying parties. Think about them as stakeholders. That may be a payer organization out there that's mandating that. It could be a provider organization. It could be something in between. HITRUST really gives you that basis and that mechanism to communicate your level of maturity that many other certifications and really framework adoptions that it doesn't provide the same level. So I'm a believer. You're probably going to hear it as we go through this. I'm going to be touting it. There is some practicality when it comes to this type of work, which is not lost on me. But challenge us with those tough questions, ask us those hard questions, because that's really where I think the benefit will come out for the greater audience is when we ask very specific use cases. All right, I want to add a little context or set a little context for the entire conversation. This is how enterprise health, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about is how enterprise health goes about preparing, evaluating, validating, and submitting an organization for certification. Not every assessor does it this way. We do it deliberately because we find it creates a better success for our customers in being deliberate in working through these phases. But as a general comment, we built our methodology to be 4 phases. The whole idea is that when we get into what you see on the slide right now is validation, we don't want any surprises. We don't want to get done with validation only to realize that the organization has not attained the scores in order to receive a certification. So for us, it really starts with scoping. And I'm a military guy. This is a foot stomping moment in this presentation. Scoping is the most important phase of getting HITRUST certified. If you do not get your scope right up front, it is not only going to increase the amount of time that it could take you to get certified, but it will likely result in a wasted effort. And there's really 2 scenarios. One is overscoping, meaning you've included more than you needed to in the scope and the amount of work just becomes unbearable. Or you've underscoped and you have not included what is actually necessary based on your business drivers and trying to get HITRUST certified into the scope of the assessment. We have seen, unfortunately, organizations who have come to us, say in phase 3, where they're fixing things, where we get a look at it, we look under the hood and realize that their scope is not satisfying their business needs. So we end up having to go back to phase 1, work through phase 2, so on and so forth. So foot stomping moment, scoping, scoping, scoping. And a question I always get is, when should we bring an assessor organization in? As early as possible. So phase 2 is how we benchmark our customers' security and privacy programs. So you'll go through a readiness assessment, you'll answer all the questions, provide scores, write comments, add evidence. We review that. We develop what we call action items, which is basically just a recommended remediation effort. Then we go into phase 3 remediation. This is where we prioritize those remediation efforts because you likely will not be able to fix every single thing. So the idea is that we are going to fix the things needed to at least attain a passing score for certification. And then we actually do the validation work in phase 4, and then it gets submitted to HITRUST. You can see at the bottom, it's a recurring life cycle. So at 12 months after your certification date, you'll have to do an interim assessment. And then 12 months after your interim assessment is done, you have to do a recertification. Now, this slide is relevant because when we get into the new assessment types, things change a little bit when it comes to this life cycle, which I'm not going to get into in this moment. I just want to kind of set the context of this is where HITRUST is today. The whole premise for the conversation we're going to have really boils down to levels of assurance. And what does assurance mean? And I did a presentation over the summer where we specifically talked about assurance and what that means. And the simplest form that I can put it in is giving your relying parties, AKA stakeholders, that could be business partners, that could be customers, it could be someone else, a level of comfort that if they do business with you, if they enter into an agreement with you, if they share data with you, that you are doing what you say you're doing from a security and privacy perspective. And I'll go back really quick to the days of old where there would be just spreadsheets with 300 questions sent out, and if you were the organization that sent it out, you likely got it back, and it was just all yes, no answers. And if you were the organization that was filling it out, you put yes or no answers because you're probably getting about 50 of those a month, depending on your size of your organization. Those days are still here, but this is the problem that HITRUST is trying to solve. That mechanism provides a very, very low level of assurance because it's not very transparent. You don't really get a good indication of the maturity of the controls that have been answered yes or no. There's really no consistency from organization to organization or even a questionnaire to questionnaire to make sure all the bases are being covered. The other piece that is sometimes not realized is if you're an organization that's answering that questionnaire, you're married to your assessment. And oh, by the way, you're trying to do business. And I'm not saying anybody is nefarious, but nobody likes to call their own baby ugly. And as a relying party, I would need to know whether your baby is ugly or not. So it's just not an effective use to communicate maturity from a security and privacy perspective. So that is, if we put it in a hierarchy, that is the lowest level assurance that you can be provided if you are a relying party. And not all assurances are created equal. You know, we don't need to, and if you look at the fourth bullet, kill a mosquito with a cannon, meaning we don't need to send a vendor that has no administrative access into our environment with no sensitive data. Maybe they're just the cleaning crew. We don't need to send them a 300 or 400 questionnaire or assessment to get the information that we need out of them, which may revolve around hiring and termination procedures, how are we doing background checks, what level of access will they have, so on and so forth. It's really important to understand that your vendors or your stakeholders, there's different needs for assurance. But at the lowest level, there needs to be a level of assurance. So that's really the context for what we're going to talk about today. And what HITRUST has done is they've expanded their assessment portfolio. Up until basically the end of 2021, there was really only two assessment types. There was something called a readiness assessment, which was kind of exactly what it sounds like. An assessed entity would fill out the assessment. They would send it into HITRUST. HITRUST did very little QA, QC, or validation that what's in that assessment is actually functioning and it's actually there and it's working and all that fun stuff. So it gave you a very low level of assurance. That yes, they ran some checks on it, but it was never designed to provide a higher level of assurance. The second assessment type was called the validated assessment. The validated assessment was the only assessment type that could result in a certification. So the readiness assessment could never result in a certification. That validated assessment required a third party like Enterprise Health to come in and validate that the work that the assessed entity is doing relative to the scope of their assessment actually is in place, it's actually functioning, it's repeatable, all those things that we talk about from a security and privacy perspective. Once that assessment, that validated assessment was completed by the external assessor, that's when it would get submitted to HITRUST and would either result in a certification, or if the proper scores were not attained, it would result in what's called a validated report. So now HITRUST has come out with new versions of their assessment types, and they've also added an additional one. So the lowest and the fastest is now called the basic current state assessment. It's pretty much the same as the readiness assessment, but what happens now, instead of HITRUST just going in and making sure that all the fields were filled out, checking grammatical errors, checking continuity errors from a scope and things like that, they actually run automation against it, artificial intelligence that will actually look for discrepancies based on the answers in the assessment. So it's a bit more reliable than the previous readiness assessment. It provides a low level of assurance, but it still is not going to check on whether that organization is, hiding the fact that their baby is ugly, whether they know it or not. The previous validated assessment is now called the R2, risk-based 2-year assessment. So all they've done there is just rebranded it. It's the same requirements, it's the same steps to get certified or result in a validated report. So no real change there other than the name. I will add that that creates the highest level of assurance, and I'll touch on kind of where the R2 stands against other frameworks within, I don't want to say the healthcare industry, but industries, where it kind of stacks against those in later on in the presentation. But the new assessment type is called an I1, which is an implemented 1-year assessment. This is specifically designed to provide a moderate level of assurance. It's designed to satisfy a gap in the market between a low level of assurance and a high level of assurance across really any framework. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is those different assessment types. I'm going to toss it over to Liz here in a second, and she's going to break down the different assessment types, talk about use cases, things like that. And then we're also going to talk about recent MyCSF enhancements. So for those of you who may not be really seasoned with HITRUST, MyCSF is the web-based portal in which all assessments are completed. So really quickly, looking at the results of the poll, where are we at, Siobhan?
60% are saying they are familiar.
Okay, so we're mostly familiar, which is great because that gives us the ability to stay high level, but also dig deep as necessary. So Liz, do you want to talk about the basic current state really quickly?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So the basic current state assessment, like Ryan said, kind of mimics the readiness assessment that we've seen over the years. It's a self-assessment, so you're taking your own understanding of your environment and your controls without any external assessor validation. It's also limited to 71 requirements, and you don't have to provide any evidence. So you're looking at the implemented maturity level, but you don't actually have to provide screenshots or samples of anything you've implemented. So because of all of this, it is a low level of assurance, and it's pretty rapid too. You can get it done relatively quickly. But it does have benefits, and there are situations where this could be the right option for you. I will say it's not going to be the right option for you if you're seeking a quick certification. You can't be certified from the BC assessment, but it may be the right option if you know that you want to be assessed a couple of years down the road and you're trying to figure out, is my organization ready? What kind of controls might we see? This could be a good way to get your feet wet. It could also be good if you're obligated, contractually obligated with a third party to be certified. This might be a good first step to understand either how far you've come with your security stature, or how far you really need to go. I'd always recommend talking to your external assessor before deciding to do the BC or a regular readiness assessment, because there are nuances and there are different reasons why you may decide to go with this or one of the other assessment options. Ryan, I don't know if you have anything else to add about the BC. I didn't want to spend too much time on this one because it is something that won't get you certified on its own. So.
Yeah. So just to expand on a comment that you made, Liz. Typically, what we see with as a use case, or if you will, payers will kind of mandate contractually, hey, 6 months from contract signing, you need to complete a readiness assessment, 12 months validated, 18 months certified. So there is a place for the BC assessment, especially when you're working with someone who's mandating HITRUST, to get a good idea of where you stand. It is not the full assessment. It is not as difficult, but it gives you a taste of what HITRUST is really looking for, and it also gives your relying parties an idea of kind of where you stand. So we typically see this as a stepping stone into what used to be the validated assessment, the now R2.
You have a question. How do you compare the BC to an SRA?
They're similar. They're similar in practicality, meaning the way you're actually going to fill it out. You know, if you're doing an SRA, and I'll break that down even further. So if you're just doing your own risk assessment, you may bring in a third party to have that work done. Or if you're filling out a risk assessment that's been sent to you on behalf of some kind of stakeholder, it's basically the same as this. You're answering the questions to the test. Nobody is coming in behind you. The only difference, and I think this is the piece that elevates the BC from a standard SRA, is HITRUST will actually run that assurance intelligence engine against it to identify discrepancies or gaps, meaning HITRUST is really, really good at, hey, in domain 6, you said this, but in domain 12, you said something else. Where is the truth? So that would be identified and ultimately would need to be corrected before they would issue that BC report. But generally, workflow perspective, it's very similar to doing a risk analysis. There is a subtle difference between a risk analysis and really any assessment for HITRUST. Risk analysis will likely result in a laundry list of actual risk that is tailored directly to the control that was checked. HITRUST does base their assessments off of risk, but it's based off of organizational risk as opposed to individual risk based on the threat and the control type. Back over to you, Liz.
So the next assessment type is the I1. It's called the Implemented One-Year Validated Assessment, and it's meant to provide moderate assurance with moderate effort. I think of it as a somewhat limited version of the HITRUST validated assessment that we've come to know and love over the years. It has 219 preset requirements, and similarly to the BC, you're only looking at the implemented maturity level. The difference there is that you do need to provide evidence as you normally would with an R2 certification, and it also does need to be certified by an external assessor. I guess I'll add too, it goes through HITRUST's normal QA process, and you can be certified using this. You achieve your certification for 1 year, and that's kind of the difference with the historic assessment that we've seen. It's a 2-year cycle, like Brian talked about earlier. This is a 1-year cycle, so after 1 year, you'd have to go through the certification again. It's a good option if you're, you're obligated to achieve certification, but you don't need to demonstrate that high level of assurance and compliance that you'd have with a typical R2. Or maybe your program's not mature enough that you want to go through with an R2 certification. R2 versus I1, requires policy and process review. So that's another reason if your policies and procedures aren't in place, but you are actually performing these controls, this could be the right kind of assessment for you. And Ryan, I don't know if you have any other input here either.
Yeah, so a couple of things to think about with the I-1, which is the new kid on the block, right? We're going to learn a lot. This is now only just become available. There's very few that have been completed to date. But the I-1, as Liz mentioned, it's a predefined set of controls. But that predefined set of controls is based off of threat intelligence that HITRUST is reviewing currently on a monthly basis. So as the threat landscape changes, those requirements, the preset requirements could and likely will change. That doesn't mean that if in January of 2022 you generate your assessment object and the threat landscape in February change, or let's say in June changes, and you've been working on it for 6 months, that your control will change. Those requirements are going to stay the requirements through the entire assessment. But as the threat landscape changes, HITRUST may make adjustments to the predefined set of controls to address that threat landscape. The other probably most important thing to consider, especially if you're a healthcare organization when it comes to the I-1, is this will not satisfy quote unquote HIPAA compliance. It doesn't cover all of the aspects of HIPAA, mostly because it's only looking at the implementation level. It's not looking at most of the organizational elements of what HIPAA is asking for. So if you are using your HITRUST certification as a mechanism to demonstrate HIPAA compliance, the I-1 likely is not for you. Now, I don't want to make anything that we say here definitive because really every situation is a little bit different. We've already been talking to folks that are moving from an R2 to an I-1, but they have very specific reasons for doing that. The other big, I don't want to say unanswered question, but the answer that I don't have is, if you remember historically, the large payers in the country have required all of their business associates to get HITRUST certified. I don't know if those payers are now willing to accept the I-1. That is still a question that I need answered. And really the payers are the only ones that can answer that. Do I see the I-1 being leveraged against the mandate from the payers? Absolutely. We've had a lot of success, even when, I mentioned that 3-step mandate from the payers where you start with readiness, you do a validated, you go for certification over an 18-month period. We've seen a lot of success in talking to the payers and getting them to agree with our plan on how to attain certification, which could include I-1. It could buy you some time, but that is very dependent on how you're working with that stakeholder. And if you're considering the I-1, the first question or the first thing I would encourage you to do is talk to your relying parties, talk to your stakeholders, outline what the I-1 is. If they're familiar with the R2, then they should have a decent idea of what the I-1 is. Are they willing to accept that? If they're willing to accept it, then I think that could be very compelling for your organization, depending on what's going on within your business. There's no silver bullet really for any of these things. As Liz mentioned, talk to HITRUST, talk to external assessors. These are folks that are doing this stuff every single day, and they will guide you down the right path. Ultimately, it's your decision, it's your stakeholders' decision, but I think there's a spot for the basic state and the I-1 in the greater scheme of what you're doing from a HITRUST CSF perspective.
We have a question about, are all 219 requirements reassessed during I-1, or is verification based on random sampling per domain?
The 219 requirements will be sprinkled in between the 19 domains of the current assessment methodology. Those will not change. You'll go through, if you're familiar with the R2, the I-1 is going to look very similar. The only difference is is there's no question on how large the assessment's going to be. It's always going to be that 219. But you also are not going to focus on the first two maturity levels, that being policy and procedure. So you only focus on implemented, and that won't change either. Any other questions on that, Siobhan?
No, that's it.
All right, Liz, I'm working on getting to the next slide. There you go.
Thanks. So yeah, the R2, just to kind of go over it for comparison's sake against the I1, it's the standard 2-year risk-based validated assessment. It's, you know, the one we've seen up to this point, and it's a significant amount of effort for a high level of assurance. The number of requirements ranges. It's between 198 and 2,000 based on your risk factors and the regulatory factors that you select. So it's tailorable to your organization and your compliance needs. I'll add there, HITRUST said that the average number of requirements is 360, which I think from experience, I probably agree with that. About 360 is what you might be able to expect, but it can get a lot larger depending on your organization. All maturity levels are considered. So we're looking at policies, procedures, and your implementation. Depending on the maturity of your organization, you might look at measured and managed. And the 2-year certification cycle, like Ryan talked about earlier, is a certification 1 year. Next year, you go through your interim assessment. And then the following year, you go for recertification. You can do a readiness assessment with this. I don't think I mentioned for the I1, but you can also do a readiness assessment for your I1. But the bridge assessment does not apply to the I1. The bridge assessment you could use in a situation where you have certification with an R2 assessment, but your maybe your certification is going to lapse for some reason. So the bridge assessment can be that bridge that gives you a little bit more time. But that bridge assessment does not apply to the I1. So again, in comparison to the I1 or the BC, the use case for this is if you're trying to demonstrate a high level of compliance. Like Ryan said, there could be, you know, third parties that are requiring HITRUST certification, and it's not known whether or not the I1 will fulfill that yet. But the R2, again, is the standard that we've seen for years, and I think the newer options are nice because it's giving you a few other routes that you can take for certification compared to this, which is, you know, a significant effort on your organization.
Yeah, I would add,
Brian, yep.
as if I put my security purist hat on for a second, this is the cat's meow, right? This is ultimately, if resources were unlimited, money wasn't an issue, time wasn't an issue, this is what I would tell everybody to go after. What this produces, in my opinion, is the highest level of assurance of any framework on the planet. And that sounds very dramatic, and I'm doing it on purpose. But if you look at other frameworks, the amount of touches on that assessment, whether it results in certification or a report like a SOC 2, the levels of assurance are lacking to a degree. And we'll use SOC 2 as an example. When you complete a SOC 2, there's really 2 levels of checks or people that are involved, or 2 organizations that are involved to get that report. And then ultimately, if you're a consumer of that report, there's only really 2 levels that you can rely on, that what you're reading is accurate, it's true, it's there, it's functioning. That's the organization that's being assessed. They're required to fill out and sign a management assertion letter saying that this report and the assessment was done accurately, and so on and so forth. And then it's actually the AICPA firm who comes in and does the work. So you get really like 2 levels of validation, if you will, to use a bad term, where you can walk away feeling comfortable. HITRUST, I would argue, has 5 levels, and I'll walk you through that. Similar to SOC 2, there's a management assertion letter that is submitted. So the executives of that organization are saying, yes, this is in place, yes, it's working, just like a SOC 2. Similar to a SOC 2, there's a requirement for an external assessor like Enterprise to come in and actually validate that what you say is in your organization, in your program is functioning, it's consistent, it's repeatable. Additionally, we're required, Enterprise and every other assessor, we're required by HITRUST to take a completely separate team within our organization and do a QA on that assessment. So right now that's 3 different looks by 3 different groups on that one assessment to identify gaps or issues. Once that's complete, my team at Enterprise will submit that to HITRUST. HITRUST then runs actually an AI tool against it to identify issues, discrepancies, all that fun stuff. If it passes that, it goes into their internal QA. So they have an internal QA team that will then look at the assessment as well and try to poke holes through it. If the assessment gets through that or is worked on and passed through their QA, it goes to their compliance team, and the compliance team ultimately certifies the report and then issues the report. So there's 5 layers, arguably, maybe 6, where if I'm a consumer of a HITRUST certification report, I have a really, really good feeling that that organization is functioning exactly the way that report says it's functioning. The other piece of this, unlike the basic current state and the I-1, is you can tailor this assessment to your individual needs. So with the I-1, it has some flavors of HIPAA in it, has some flavors of NIST, but they're very specific. There's I think over 40 different regulatory factors, regulatory bodies or other frameworks that you can select as a part of your assessment to demonstrate compliance against those. And you see some of those listed there. Obviously HIPAA, FedRAMP, the NIST CSF. There's state-specific laws and regulations, primarily in Texas, Nevada, Massachusetts, and others, that you can select if you're doing business in those states to demonstrate compliance. So it's a way more tailorable and has greater coverage than any other assessment type in the HITRUST portfolio, but arguably in any other framework as well. So it's very versatile, it's very scalable, and like I said, it's the cat's meow when it comes to demonstrating your compliance and your commitment to security and privacy. This will, and with version 9.6 for HITRUST, you can actually demonstrate your HIPAA compliance through the R2 assessment. I'll pause there, Siobhan. I think we had a question on the R2.
Is the R2 effectively the current state, current validated assessment?
Yes, it is, and I mentioned this earlier. This is basically just a rebranding. There's no difference if you've gone through a validated assessment that resulted in certification. This is no different, same exact thing, same look and feel, same requirements. Any other questions?
Can you also clarify if this is, if I implement is this implemented the 1-year I-1 is the same as the 1-year interim assessment that you need to do on the first anniversary after the initial certification? So is it the same thing?
It is not the same thing, and that's a great question. So the I-1 is basically a mechanism to get certified and demonstrate compliance, similar to the R2. The R2, because it's a 2-year certification cycle, the I-1 is only 1 year. At the 12-month mark of being certified for the R2, you're required to go through an interim assessment. And really what that interim assessment is a check on learning, so to speak. It is a way for you to demonstrate to HITRUST that you have kept up with the adoption of the CSF itself. So the way that works is there will be 19 requirements, one from each of the 19 domains that will be randomly selected, that you'll have to show that you've kept current and is still functioning, it's still repeatable, it's still consistent. Anywhere where there was a corrective action plan identified or required in your original certification, which we didn't touch on, happy to do that if there's specific questions about it. but you would have to demonstrate that you have made meaningful progress against those corrective action plans at the interim. Doesn't mean you have to complete them all, doesn't mean they all have to be closed, but you should have made overall meaningful progress on all the caps that were identified in the original certification. So that's the nuance between the interim and the I-1. I-1 is a certification, interim is more of just a confirmation that you're still, you still have adopted the CSF and it's operating day in and day out within your organization. All right, so Liz, I want to touch a little bit on this, but I know we're getting close on time, and I want to open it up for questions if there are any at the end. We'll probably gloss over some of the rest of the slides, but I spent a little time here talking about what HITRUST has just released because it does have impacts on timelines and certification plans and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so I'll go quickly over this because a lot of the changes in MyCSF right now are more focused on the assessors. So I won't get into details on that, but going through these, there's a new workflow where HITRUST has reorganized and changed names of some of the phases within the portal, and that's to provide some transparency and also, you know, an easier look at the status of each assessment. So phases like not started, we see a lot, and assessment submitted to external assessor, those are phased out and they're going to be named, renamed to provide clarity on who's actually owning that phase and what the status of that phase is. Similarly, there's a current check-in process where HITRUST receives your assessment and then runs some automatic checks to make sure that, you know, scoping information is correct and there are no red flags. They're adding steps in the portal to show when those phases are going on. I guess the one big change with this one is that the step for creating caps, and this is related to the R2 assessment, the step for creating and approving caps is going to come before your actual submission date. So currently, the process is that you go through your validation, your assessor reviews everything, puts in the test plan, the working paper, you have to sign your representation letter, and then you submit to HITRUST. Once they go through the QA process, they'll give you your draft report, and you'll have to generate your corrective action plans, your caps, and submit those back to HITRUST before you receive your final report. The difference here now is that once you go through your external assessor validation, your external assessor says, okay, this is good to go. Before you sign the rep letter and actually submit to HITRUST, the caps are generated. And your external assessor and yourself will have to go through and approve those caps, and then you submit to HITRUST. So the timeline for certification changes a little bit. You have to build time into pre-submission, which could affect your submission reservation. So that's something to keep in mind as you're going through, and you know, if you're creating an assessment that could be affected by these changes, which I'll get into in a minute, which assessments are actually affected. The status dashboard is kind of exactly as it sounds. They're going to provide some more visualizations to give you an idea of where each domain is at, where each assessment is at. Web forms are kind of a way to phase out the overview and scope. If you're familiar with that document, it's the heart of the assessment where all of your scoping information lives, your facilities, just organizational information that may be relevant for your certification. So they're creating web forms that will automatically import that information into MyCSF. And the use of that is that later on, when it comes to submission time, that information can be exported directly to your report. So it does streamline a few of the processes, and it makes it so that you have relevant and well-organized scoping information earlier in the process, in a location where both the assessed entity and the assessor can locate it and reference it as you go through your assessment. Notifications and tasks. So as some of you may know, if you're in MyCSF, the notification system isn't exactly, it isn't so useful. You get those emails that have, you know, you have one new notification in MyCSF, and that's the only information that you get. So they're changing the notification system to provide more of a summary for your assessment. They'll have open requirements, closed requirements, you know, how long those requirements have been opened or closed and who's responsible for them. And they're also keeping that information in the portal. So on top of getting those email notifications, there'll be tasks in the portal that give you a better visual representation. There are more tasks that I think are a little more relevant to assessors than they are the assessed entity. QA is going to be housed in the portal now, so it'll be easier to make changes sometime for HITRUST QA, but that is something that does end up affecting the assessor a bit more. There are times where, as an assessed entity, you may find that you have to go in and change something based on HITRUST QA, so it may be something you come across. But even if it's not, I do think that ultimately the changes to where QA is housed will help streamline that final step, and it'll make it a lot more efficient, so it should help your certification timeline to make it go a little quicker. Finally, the report format changes. I kind of touched on this, but based on the web forms, the final report's a little different than it used to be. So the information that used to be in the organizational overview and scope will be exported directly to your final report. So that's your scope, your organization's information, you know, where you're located, the facilities, and third parties that you might be relying on. That'll just go directly into the report. And I think that pretty much covers at a high level the details of the changes in the portal. I do want to specify, so these changes are coming, but they won't affect everyone just yet. So starting February 15th, if you create an assessment in the portal, they will have these new enhancements. But if you have an existing assessment, it will only be affected if you haven't submitted anything to your assessor yet. So it would be in the not started phase. But if you submitted even one domain to your assessor, then it won't, these changes won't take into effect for you. I'll say that over the years, changes in the portal have been good and bad, but these I'm very excited for. I think it'll just make the entire assessment process go a little more smoothly. And I do think it smooths out the submission process because it can get stressful near the end of submission and there are a lot of moving parts, and this does create a clearer pathway and a lot more transparency.
One thing I would add, thinking about that February 15th date, is I would talk to your external assessor before making any decisions, before you quickly send one domain to your assessor just so these changes don't take effect in your assessment. You don't want to make a decision that I don't think it will negatively impact, but there may be some benefits for those with these changes that take effect. So I wouldn't just go and do that without talking to your external assessor and kind of getting the lay of the land.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we've even had some discussions internally about, you know, should we get one domain over so that we can not have these changes come into effect, but they are positive. They all really are positive. So if there's time in the schedule for it, it's good to allow, but definitely check with your external assessor before making those decisions.
So I'm going to gloss over this slide really quickly because I want to make sure we get time for some questions that have come through. From a scoping perspective, foot stomping. This is most important thing you do during the assessment. One thing to realize, you all as the assessed entity have all the authority to empower to define your scope. HITRUST will not define your scope. Your external assessor will not define your scope, meaning they're not going to tell you that you need to put something in scope. It sounds great. I mean, the one caveat is if you don't put what you need in scope, then the assessment and certification may not be what you need it is. So your external assessor in HITRUST may guide you towards that, but you get to decide. There's not going to be any gotchas, you know, saying, oh, we know you have system X, Y, or Z in your environment. Why is that not in scope? HITRUST doesn't care whether you put a system in scope or not. That's for you to decide. One thing that we do at IH is that we provide engagement letters. This is a way of providing a level of assurance to relying parties that you're in the process of getting certified. Typically, we outline where you're at, what the anticipated certification date is, and that's sent off. It has worked really well in a lot of different cases. So something to put in your toolkit when you're working with your stakeholders. I'm not going to get really into the weeds on the next bullet around the 60 and 90-day windows. Just know they exist, and they exist primarily for the R2 assessment, but that could impact your submission timeline. So understanding where you're at and how those windows work, talk to your external assessor, because you want to be able to maximize your scores. And if you don't observe those windows, you may not be able to. Submission and QA. If you know that in November of 2022, you want to submit, put that into the QA reservation system now. The way that that system is working, it's actually great. It's such an amazing improvement over what used to happen on getting HITRUST to run their QA on the assessment. Now you can plan on it. If your window is February 15th to February 22nd, your QA will happen during that window. And I'll just touch on the last point, and then we can get to, I think, questions. The most critical thing, the one thing that I preach to my customers is this is not about certification. Certification is the icing on the cake. The cake is actually adoption. We want you all, and really everybody else, to adopt the CSF for a number of reasons. One, it's going to give you a mechanism to make sure that you're prepared and resilient in case of an issue. But it also makes life in this HITRUST certification life cycle a lot easier, because you will incrementally be changing things throughout that 2-year period. And if you've adopted it and you've put that workflow in place in your own organization, generating the evidence and updating policies will be happening in real time. So when it actually comes to the validation, it's not a sprint in the last 60 days to try to develop 500 to 1,000 artifacts to demonstrate your compliance. And yes, on average, we have anywhere between 800 and 1,000 artifacts in every given assessment to demonstrate compliance. So I'm going to get on my soapbox, realize that it never ends, and that's a good thing, and you should be thinking about it every single day. All right, we're going to open it up to questions, but as we do that, we have a poll question that I'd like you all to fill out while we answer some of these questions. So that should be popping up for you also.
So in terms of questions, we've gotten a couple that want to know if you're underway with one. So if you're doing an R2 and you want to switch to an I1, can you do that, or vice versa?
The simplest answer is yes. You can switch. Right now, I don't know what the mechanism to do that within the portal is. Like I said, the I1 is brand new, just released this month. So we're still learning, just like everybody else is, how that mechanism will work, but there's nothing saying that you have to complete the R2 if you want to do an I1 and vice versa. So you can absolutely switch.
Okay. How can I use vendor certifications, e.g. Google Cloud HITRUST certification for my HITRUST?
So there's an entire program that is in effect called the Inheritance Program. Some of your major service providers, your cloud service providers, are in that program. Google Cloud, Azure, AWS. What you can do, because I think if you've been around HITRUST or even IT long enough, there's only a finite amount of things that are in your span of control. If you're hosted in the cloud, that physical infrastructure, that physical security of that cloud environment is not something within your span of control. But HITRUST still expects you to account for that and demonstrate compliance. And how do you do that if you're hosted in AWS? Well, there's a mechanism within MyCSF where you can actually take the relevant controls and AWS's answers and artifacts and pull it into your assessment. which covers the need to demonstrate compliance without you doing it. So the inheritance program, a great program. We probably could talk an hour just on inheritance alone. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But there's definitely a mechanism for you to do that.
Okay.
I do want to add to, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Very quickly, I do want to add to, I was watching the HITRUST webinar about the new assessment types, and they mentioned that for the BC and the I-1 assessments, you can carve out inheritance and reliance on those third or fourth parties. When I say that that's all the information that they said on that call, that's all the information that they had. So that's something we'll have to learn more about as time goes on. But it is just another differentiator between the I-1, the BC, and the R2.
Okay, so it looks like we have time for one more, and this one is, as our business grows and changes, can we change our HITRUST certification scope? How often, and what does that involve? I know we've talked a bit about scoping, but.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir when it comes to the audience that their business is dynamic. It's not static. It's changing based on the way the industry is demanding things, other market factors, mergers and acquisitions. How does that all impact scope? Well, as any good security person would answer, it depends. It depends on what has changed. So there is a mechanism to change scope if it doesn't have a major impact on the scope of the assessment. If there is a material change of scope, that would result in a retesting of those controls that have been impacted, or it may require a completely new certification. So you would go, instead of doing the interim, you would go back through certification if it's in that first 12-month period. But there is definitely ways to change your scope kind of midstream, really at any point, whether you've been certified or not. There's definitely mechanisms to change that based on what's happening in your company. As we've probably said several times now, talk to your external assessor. If you don't have one, find one. They will help you make those decisions.
I think that's it. We have a bunch more that will go deeper. So if we didn't answer your question, please feel free to reach out, and we will try to reach out to you as well. I wanted to thank Liz and Ryan for doing this, and thank all of you for attending. We will get out to you the slides, and if you are interested in speaking with one of our HITRUST assessors, please respond. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great one.
Thank you.